Hello and welcome to our webinar, Cybertechnology and the Law. My name is State Representative Stephen Ucci from Rhode Island, and I will be moderating our webinar today. I'd like to thank the National Conference of State Legislatures for funding and coordinating production of this webinar. Also, 3 groups of the NCSL are co-sponsoring our webinar: the Cybersecurity Task Force, of which I'm a member, the Research, Editorial, Legal, and Committee Staff Association, and the National Association of Legislative Information Technology. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NCSL website within a few days. We encourage you to enter any questions that you may have during the presentation in the chat box at the lower left corner of your screen. We will then answer those at the end of the presentations. So please ask them please enter them as you think of them. We're glad to have you here with us today to learn about the expanding realm of technology and our ability to create effective laws to keep up with this trend. Our intent is to provide you with an approach to understanding the policy implementations of new technologies and way to avoid outdated cyber technology laws or unintended consequences. Even here in Rhode Island, we have been working on many of these challenges. In the past, we've updated our data breach and privacy statute. We have streamlined the application of laws and regulations impacting drones. And this year, we embarked upon some legislation regarding small cell technology in order to usher in 5G. As everyone on the conference call is aware, this topic is important, it's ever-changing, and it's something that has to be at the top of everyone's mind in all of our legislators. Our presenters today are Ryan Harkins, Director of State Affairs and Public Policy for Microsoft, and David Barry, an attorney with the Division of Legislative Services in Virginia. We'll hear from Ryan Harkins first. Ryan is the Director of State Affairs and Public Policy at Microsoft, where he serves as the lead lawyer on legislation and policy issues for Microsoft's State Government Affairs team. In that capacity, he has led the company's state and federal work on a range of federal and state privacy and data security issues, including student privacy, encryption, and biometrics legislation. He has practiced at Microsoft since 2007 and has expertise in a range of privacy issues relating to product and service development, wiretap law, online advertising, children, marketing, and data breach notification. Mr. Harkins is also an adjunct professor at Seattle University School of Law, where he teaches courses on big data, privacy, and discrimination, and on cybercrime and government surveillance. Before joining Microsoft, Mr. Harkins worked as a litigator in Seattle and served as a law clerk to Judge Fred Van Sickle, U.S. District Court, Eastern District of Washington. He holds a BA from the University of Notre Dame and a JD from the University of Washington School of Law, where he served on the Washington Law Review and graduated with high honors and Order of the Cloth. Mr. Harkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Ucci, and thank you to NCSL for having me here today. So each minute that passes by as we sit here today, nearly 700 new pieces of malware are created. On average, nearly 4,000 records will be compromised, and $5.7 million of market value will be destroyed by cybercrime every minute. Cyber threats are profound, they're costly, and they're growing. And we know that we have a serious problem. I mean, one need only see the headlines today, and apparently the slides don't want to move forward for me, but one only needs to see the headlines today to know that cybercrime has evolved. It has evolved from, at least a decade ago, relatively unsophisticated attacks into sophisticated attacks that are put forward by organized crime and increasingly by nation states. And we can see this in some of the data. So we know, for example, that just last year alone, 2 billion records were compromised. And on average, hackers can gain complete access to, there we go, that's what I was looking for. Hackers on average can gain complete access to your system within 24 to 48 hours of an attack being launched. And what's especially scary about that is that it typically takes an average of 140 days between infiltration and detection. So think of all the damage that hackers can do during that time when they are traipsing around in your systems undetected. And this is incredibly costly. Just last year, the average cost of a data breach has increased to $15 million, which to most of us is real money. Now, why is this? I think it's helpful sometimes to take a step back and remind ourselves of the broader context. I mean, we are living through a time of profound change, and it's a time that many are now referring to as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So if you go back to the 18th century, to the First Industrial Revolution, that began with the steam engine. The steam engine revolutionized transportation. It shrunk the world. And it led at its end to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, something which changed the time it took to cross the country from over 3 months to a little more than a week. You fast forward to the Second Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 19th century and leading up to the early 20th century. This brought us advances in communications, the telegraph. It brought us mass production, which for the first time enabled us to produce things like automobiles for the masses. Third Industrial Revolution in the 1960s was really the era of the PC. And at its beginning, a young entrepreneur who we've heard of here at Microsoft named Bill Gates had a dream to put a PC on every desk and in every home. At its conclusion, you'd see a smartphone in every hand and in every pocket. And that takes us to today. And today we are really living through the era of the data center, or what some people refer to as the era of cloud computing. And that means a couple of things. One is it means we are increasingly collecting massive amounts of data in data centers around the world. And that includes all kinds of sensitive data that can be used for nefarious purposes. And it's, I think, helpful to note just how much data we're talking about. So if everyone is familiar with, the fact that computer data is made up of a series of zeros and ones. And each of those numbers is a bit. You put 8 of them together and you have a byte. Well, you take 1,000 bytes and you have a kilobyte. You take 1,000 kilobytes, you have a megabyte. And it used to be that 1,000 megabytes is a gigabyte. Gigabyte used to be a lot of data. But increasingly, we're talking about terabytes. 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. But terabytes are not even table stakes anymore. What are table stakes are increasingly petabytes. Petabytes is 1,000 terabytes. Now, how much is a petabyte? Well, 1 petabyte is the equivalent of 20 million 4-drawer filing cabinets filled with text. And in fact, the entire written works of human history consist of 50 petabytes. So that's an incredibly large amount of data. But petabytes aren't even table stakes anymore. We're now talking not only about petabytes, but exabytes. And increasingly, we will not only be talking about exabytes, an exabyte is 1,000 petabytes, but zettabytes. Microsoft currently has 6 zettabytes of data in its data centers worldwide, and it is estimated that by the year 2020, we will be processing collectively 35 zettabytes of data per year. That is just a massive amount of data, and it will come from, the Internet of Things and connected devices, which of course are also increasing exponentially. All of that data offers a very attractive target to cybercriminals. Another way to look at this is to look at the number of devices that are connected to the Internet and how that has increased over the last 17 years. So this is a map that depicts the number of internet users per country, which is demonstrated by the size of the squares, and then the color depicts the saturation of each market. And you can see back in 2000, back when, you know, we were all very concerned about Y2K, anyone remember that? You can see that the U.S. was far and away the world's largest internet user with 122 million people. You fast forward 10 years, and the U.S. has grown considerably to 229 million, but China has raced past us with 458 million users. You fast forward to what we expect the world to look like in 2020, and China will continue to race past us with an estimated 765 million internet users. India will race past us, and other developing countries, Nigeria, Brazil, etc., will continue to grow. All of those devices mean attractive targets for cyber criminals. And you can just, one needs only to look at the world around us to see that this is the case. This, for example, is St. Peter's Square in 2005 with the election of Pope Benedict. And this is that same location only 8 years later with the election of Pope Francis. So it's clear to us that cyberspace is the new battlefield. And there are certain cybersecurity fundamentals that really every organization ought to keep in mind. I mean, here at Microsoft, we take a four-pronged integrated approach to ensure that we're doing what we can to not only protect the security of our own systems, but to make sure we are putting appropriate security measures in place to protect our products and our customers. And that begins with designing cybersecurity features into our products at the platform level. We've long had something called the Security Development Lifecycle, which is something that came out of a memo Bill Gates wrote 17 years ago, the Trustworthy Computing Memo, in which he foresaw that privacy and security were going to be need to be critical components of our business if customers would trust our products. But it also includes a range of things we do to gather data and intelligence about the kinds of threats we're seeing in the world, and then to coordinate providing appropriate fixes and providing information out to our customers and to our partners. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those things, but I think what is critical for perhaps the audience today is how are these relevant to what states could be doing to ensure that they are taking appropriate steps to protect their own information technology assets and data. And there are certain cybersecurity questions that we encourage folks to ask. The first is whether your state has a comprehensive risk-based cybersecurity and IT policy. So that would be a policy that governs all of the state's IT infrastructure and assets, and that prioritizes the actions that the state ought to take based upon the importance of specific IT systems, the sensitivity of certain data, and the likelihood of attack. You know, is your policy, if you have one, constructed and based upon widely recognized standards like the National Institute of Science and Technology or NIST Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments, and for establishing basic security baselines. The policy, any policy really, ought to do other basic things like establish clear roles and responsibilities. Who is on the line or on the hook, if you will, to make sure that the policy is robust and that different agencies and departments are complying with the policy. When was the policy last updated? Do you conduct audits to verify compliance? And do you have a plan to respond if and when you actually suffer an attack? Because the question isn't whether you will suffer an attack, it really is when. So The second question you can ask is, have your security technologies kept pace with new and rising security threats? And this is incredibly important because one of the most frequent ways we see customers get hacked is because they have not installed the latest security patches or updates. And you can't fight the threat of the present with tools of the past. So if anyone still has machines running Windows XP, for example, and Windows XP was a terrific product for its time, but it came out 6 years before the iPhone. In fact, it came out 2 months before the iPod. And it has profound vulnerabilities that in today's world just make it not an appropriate product. And, you know, many of you probably read or heard about the WannaCry and Petya cyber attacks. Those attacks propagated so quickly in large part because many folks were running machines like Windows XP, which were not supported, or other machines that simply did not have the latest security patches and fixes put in place. So, you know, a lot of security, or a lot of customers will take a traditional cybersecurity approach, and that is the sort of castle and wall approach. And the idea is you protect your systems by making sure that you keep the bad guys out. So you put all sorts of techniques in place like firewalls, and you use anti-malware and antivirus software to try to detect whether a virus or something gets in. And those kinds of technologies are important, but in today's world they're not enough. Because increasingly, cyber attackers can get beyond your castle walls or your moat and get inside. And the question is, can you detect when they do that extremely quickly? And can you put things in place to limit the damage they can do while they're inside? And so there are a few questions worth asking about your own cybersecurity technologies to make sure that you are using the latest techniques. One is, are you using multi-factor authentication? And this basically just means that rather than requiring a user to simply enter a password and a username to access their email or their account, you require them to take one additional step to log in, like respond to a text or a phone call that you send to their mobile phone. What, in fact, is your practice for updating and patching your systems? Are you, on the latest operating systems like Windows 10? Have you, in fact, installed all of the latest patches and gotten them out to make sure your machines aren't vulnerable? Third question to ask is, how do you manage systems access? Have you identified the data on your network that would be most likely to attract attackers? And have you limited the ability of your employees to access only the data they need for their job? One of the ways that attackers will gain access to systems is to take over the credentials or the username and password your employees use to access a site, and then simply use those to roam around within your system. Well, if you've limited the access that an employee has to your system, then if their credentials are compromised by an attacker, it limits what the attacker can do with those credentials. And the last question you can ask is, are you using advanced threat protection? Are you using products or technologies that utilize things like machine learning and analytics, techniques that can identify what kinds of behaviors are ordinary or typical on your system and what are not? And if we see something that appears out of the ordinary, can we not only flag it in real time, but then very quickly shut down that part of your system or shut down perhaps that particular account to make sure that the attacker is not able to do more damage? Third question we think people ought to ask is, what kind of intelligence do you have about the threats to your own system? And do you in fact have a comprehensive view in one place as to all the threats you're facing across all of the state infrastructure, rather than views that may be siloed or segregated. This is something that's very important to Microsoft. I mean, we sort of have a unique view of the world just given the scope of our products. I mean, we, for example, now we have 450 billion user authentications each month, meaning there are 450 billion times each month a customer, someone signs into one of our products. We update over 1 billion Windows devices. We scan over 400 billion emails for spam and malware. All of that gives us a lot of intelligence about the kinds of threats that we're facing in the world. But we also have other units that give us a unique view to the world. We have a digital crimes unit that consists of over 100 former prosecutors and investigators and computer forensics people, and they do things like identify and take down cyber hackers and malware. All of that gives us a lot of unique intelligence, and we're able to share it through our cyber threat intelligence program with internet service providers and customers, with our own product and security people, to make sure that we're disseminating real-time threat information so that everyone can try to make sure they're protected. But perhaps the most important thing we've done is we created a couple of years ago the Cyber Defense Operations Center. And this is the place where we have a comprehensive view of all of the threats across all of our systems and all of our products worldwide. It is maintained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It brings the 3,500 security professionals we have in the company under one umbrella. And in fact, with the introduction of the Cyber Defense Operations Center, we're now spending over $1 billion a year on cybersecurity alone. So I'm not suggesting that states can run out and create the equivalent of our Cyber Defense Operations Center, but it is important to consider whether you do in fact have a comprehensive view of all of the threats you're facing in one place. Next question is, one that might seem relatively simple, but is often overlooked, and that is to take a look at your procurement policies and processes to make sure that if you are acquiring any technology, that your vendors can actually enable you to comply with any applicable regulations and laws that apply with respect to how you protect your data. So, for example, if you have criminal justice information, can your vendor enable you to comply with the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services, or CJIS, security policy? For your tax information, will your vendor make sure you can comply with IRS Regulation 1075? Healthcare information, will your vendor make sure you can comply with HIPAA and the HITECH Act, etc.? And the last question that I'd suggest folks consider asking is, does the state have training and education programs not only for your employees, but also for the public? I mean, we know that even today, 90% of intrusions begin with someone clicking a link in an email. And really just about any employer anywhere will have at least one employee who will click on just about anything. So how can you minimize the risks that will happen? Well, make sure your employees get ongoing training about how to stay safe online. And finally, what kinds of programs are you running to make sure your constituents know how to stay safe online? And this is an area where we partnered with attorneys general and others like the AARP to hold events for seniors that we'll call scam jams, where we go out and help educate seniors on current online scams, how to avoid them, and how to stay safe online. So 5 questions I'd encourage everyone to answer. We have these in a one-page document that I'd be happy to provide. And with that, I think I would turn it back over to Representative Uchi, who I think is going to introduce David.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. Our second speaker today is David Barry. Mr. Barry serves as Executive Director and Counsel to Virginia's Joint Commission on Technology and Science and staffs the Agriculture and Natural Resources and Local Government Committees in both the House and Senate. David also serves on the Governor's Aerospace Advisory Council and the board of the Commonwealth of Virginia Innovative Technology Symposium. Mr. Barry holds a BA in Philosophy and Classical Civilizations from the University of Cincinnati and a Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland. He is not affiliated with a writer from the Miami Herald, but is happy to do book signings anyway. Mr. Barry, the program is yours.
Thank you, Representative. I'm just going to pull up mine here. Okay. And thanks, Ryan, for that amazing breakdown. What I just want to talk about today is how we in the legislature now can sort of address these issues that Ryan has pointed out are such a big problem. So we've got a few just like general kind of strategies that every time we on JCOTS go to draft a bill or study a bill are thinking about in order to make sure that we're not going to keep revisiting the exact same issue every year or two. I think we start with a general assumption that it's pretty tough to pass a law. And if there are any legislators out there, I'm sure everyone has at least a few horror stories of issues that just wouldn't die because every year something happened to block it, maybe at the last minute. So these are kind of the general principles that we're going to be talking about and the approach that we take. The first thing, we really look at definition sections a lot because with technology, a lot of the time we just don't even have a conception of what the future holds with technology. And so we want to make sure that we don't define things so narrowly that a judge is going to be able to even apply the law that we intended to something new. So take a look there on the left. We have a very broad, simple treatment for the definition of identity credential. And as you can tell, it doesn't use a lot of specific technical language. It doesn't use a lot of sort of jargon that the tech industry loves to change every couple of years. We're simply talking about something, just data or the physical object that the data might reside on. Maybe that's a flash drive, a computer, a smartphone, anything that an identity credential holder may present to verify or authenticate his identity. So very simple and straightforward. And we're going to prefer that to something like on the right where when we're talking about any crime, and this isn't even a technology type act, we're not trying to bring in every single conceptual issue that we may have. So when you read this, talking about it being unlawful for a person to cast, throw, dump, any garbage, refuse, dead animal, blah, 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 going through all of this, that works a lot of the time, but in other sort of areas of the law. But with technology, if this is going to say something like flash drive, computer, smartphone, well then as soon as tablets get invented, a judge is going to have to ask his or herself, is that included? So anytime that we try and provide every single example, then we're going to be asking ourselves that if something got left out, was that intentional? And we don't want to have to be doing that. That being said, I do want to point out one example that we had from a bill that came up this session, which was not clear, and it ultimately failed because of that lack of clarity. So when we were trying to define litter and what that might mean, what you see there in italics was the new language in the bill, but it already was saying that it means all waste material, including disposable packages, which, why would it not? And again, once we start adding in specific things, but leaving out others, then we have to ask ourselves whether something being left out is an intentional negation for that definition. So the justification in this instance was that apparently judges were saying, oh, it's just a cigarette or a cigar butt, that doesn't count as littering, and throwing out a lot of cases that prosecutors were bringing. But rightfully so, the General Assembly ended up not passing the law because no one wants to come back every couple of years to add in every single thing that could count as waste material when we can just consider it broadly in the first place. And that's especially important for technological issues because, as we know, smart or technological things just don't look the same after a few years. I think 10 years ago, no one would have even conceived of a smartphone being so prevalent, and now it's standard technology. So in 10 years, we're not even sure what it's going to look like. Our second principle that we want to talk about is really getting at regulating the activity. And I think this is especially important because in the early 2000s, at least here in Virginia, we tended to have this view that technology-related issues were somehow different than the issues that we've been dealing with for hundreds or thousands of years. So when we were revising the Computer Crimes Act, fortunately they took a very broad and general view of what a computer meant, and there we're defining it as just any device that accepts information in digital or similar form, manipulates it for a result based on a sequence of instructions. That broad definition was so helpful in defining all things that can be used for cyber crime that we really haven't had to change it in the last 12 years now. So it was incredibly helpful just to take that broad view in the first place and to get at the fact that really all cybercrime is doing the same things that were criminal or problematic historically, and now using them, either using a computer as we defined for this section of the Computer Crimes Act, or doing it, attacking computers or somehow harming somebody else's technology. So it doesn't take a completely new or reinvention of the wheel in order to get at something that will stand the test of time. And I think that's what we've been doing since this big revision that we had in 2005 that started with a study in 2003. So I have one more example of getting at the specific activity that we want to regulate as opposed to trying to capture every single piece of technology by name. In 2005, we also revised our Public Records Act. And just to give you a little background on this, at the time, what we had done was treat for FOIA requests and other saving of public records, we treated digital records as completely different and separate from anything on paper. So there were different schedules for deleting, there were different standards for what needed to be saved versus what could be deleted, and all of that. And in 2005, somebody had the bright idea of just saying, why don't we just eliminate this language and treat anything that's digital as the exact same as we would otherwise? And so after this big revision that we had, we really haven't had to revise it or change it since then, at least not in this specific section of the code. So it also allowed for the future types of records, which again, we can't predict the future, but what we can do is give a broad definition to something so that even if something is saved on a device in a way that we just have not even thought up or invented yet, we're just going to treat it the same way. And I think that's really important and intuitive, even though not everybody sees it that way right off the bat. A third general principle that JCOTS tends to sort of adhere to is one that can be, I know, a little scary for any legislators that might be out there, which is trying to delegate some of the revision of these regulations to outside parties. I know a lot of the time General Assemblies want to keep that supervision under their own control, but JCOTS has come up with at least a few ways of handling it so that that General Assembly can still get their say while being able to allow for flexibility. Because technology, like it's always evolving, really needs a slightly more flexible hand than a lot of other issues. Again, it's very hard to pass a law, and so instead of trying to get a new law passed every couple of years, it's a lot easier to allow either an agency that has experts and established rulemaking procedures in place to handle it, or what we've done often is send it out to either study commissions or other kinds of commissions, some appointed by the General Assembly, some by the governor, that look at issues as they evolve and sort of monitor them so that whatever slight changes need to be made over time can be made. So at the very least, going back to the Cybercrimes, Computer Crimes Act that we revised in 2005, one really important aspect is that at the very least we just need to let the experts take a crack at it first. Most legislators are not in the technology-related fields, and even when they are, technology has an incredibly broad scope in terms of what that could mean. So what we want to do is get many expert opinions and qualified eyes in front of issue before we actually set it down in stone, so to speak, and take a crack at it. So even though it took 2 years for our Computer Crimes Act to go through studies, go through various commissions, and have input from our Crime Commission and JCOTS and others, even though it took a couple years, now it's been 12 and we've hardly had to touch it, and it's been very effective. So I just want to talk a little bit more about some examples where sometimes we just don't get it right. We have not always been successful in Virginia in terms of keeping up with technological issues, and so it's fun to sort of Monday morning the quarterback and go back and see what we could have done better and how we can get back on track. So in 2015, JCOTS established a Cybersecurity Advisory Committee, and the goal was creating a higher education cybersecurity portal, which essentially meant we wanted to look at what higher education professors and institutions were doing in the Commonwealth and just have a central place where they could sort of list what their ongoing research was and then be able to provide that information within general terms to industry folks and others who could then get in contact with them or partner with them even in order to make sure that what we were doing in the higher education sphere was useful and relevant to the economy of the Commonwealth. It's a great idea. It began with study. We had meetings and experts come in and testify, and the bill was generally drafted well enough, but the problem was, well, one, there was no money, so we learned our lesson, of course, already that it's very tough to pass a bill, and it ultimately failed, even though we had done an okay job of at least drafting the technological issue. Fast forward to last year's session, we took a very similar bill, but this time made it broader. We made sure that it had no fiscal impact for 2 years. And this time, unlike the other bill, we shipped out the study of it to an agency called VRIC, which is our Higher Education Assets Investment Committee, and let them handle coordinating with higher education institutions, do a lot of the research, and pull together a lot of the experts involved. And in fact, we're using third-party auditors to come in and do a lot of that. So focusing on the research topics generally, and not so much the strict definition of exactly what cybersecurity, specific aspects of cybersecurity research or anything like that, has really allowed that study to go forward. In retrospect, the main things that we're looking for is trying to keep everything general enough so that in the future only minor changes need to be made. And we're trying to keep everything technology neutral in terms of what businesses and what types of technology are presently popular, as opposed to what may be popular in 5, 3, or even just a year from now. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I think I'll turn it back over to Representative Uchi.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you, Ryan. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So I will start with this one, and either of you can jump in. When a company or an ISP detects an attack, with whom do they share that information? Is it proprietary for some period of time before it's shared? So if either of you would like to speak to that.
Sure. I don't know that I would describe information that an attack has occurred as proprietary necessarily. And ISPs will have their own policies about how they respond. But, at Microsoft, we have something called Patch Tuesday, in which we, whenever we identify vulnerabilities in our products, we send them out. We send out updates or patches to all of our customers on Tuesday of every month. And then we also have, newsletters and a blog and alerts that we use to disseminate information to our customers about those vulnerabilities, which may include information about whether we've seen any attacks attempting to exploit those vulnerabilities. Now, we also have a program in which, whenever we get word that there are vulnerabilities in our products, it's obviously important for us to patch those right away because, those vulnerabilities are what bad guys like to exploit to try to get in. And so before Patch Tuesday, we have a program where we will disseminate information to trusted partners like a lot of the antivirus vendors about the vulnerabilities and perhaps also about any new threats that we're seeing so that they can update their antivirus programs as quickly as possible and be prepared so that when we announce the vulnerability on Tuesday, fixes have already been put in place so that the bad guys don't have any time to exploit them. Now, when it comes to, I'd reiterate something I said earlier in the program that one of the primary, in fact, perhaps the biggest ways that bad guys actually get in is that a lot of people are either running computers that have old software that's no longer supported, or they simply haven't implemented all of the latest security patches. So, with respect to the WannaCry and the Petya attacks we saw recently, by and large, those addressed vulnerabilities that we had already patched as of March earlier this year. So when the attacks were launched a month or two later, if all of our customers had actually implemented the fixes we put in place previously, they would have been protected. Now we took, like any attack, we took the Petya and WannaCry attacks very seriously, and we actually took some extraordinary steps in those cases to protect people. Among other things, we proactively sent out patches even to old versions of our software like Windows XP, which we're no longer supporting. But because we know that there are a number of customers around the world who are still using it, we proactively sent out fixes to make sure they'd be protected.
One of the other things for the audience to know is back in 2015, when much of Congress was gridlocked, one thing that passed unanimously and President Obama signed into law was CISA, the Cyber Information Sharing Act, which created, through Homeland Security, a process by which any type of intrusion or any breaches could actually be reported there and to be shared without liability to the companies for reasons of antitrust or third-party liability. The other thing that people should be mindful of is when a breach occurs with a company, they may be under a contractual obligation or an obligation under their insurance carrier to notify others of the breach. So they may want to hold it proprietary and not let it out, and either a customer is requiring them to disclose it to them, or the law, if it's personal information, as is the law in almost every state, that you would have to disclose that. Another question that's come up is if we could talk about some best practices states have taken for cybersecurity. So I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, perhaps, Dave.
Sure. So, unfortunately, I can really mostly only speak to Virginia because that's what I've dealt with the most. But so some practices that we generally tend to take are keeping cybersecurity regulations with our Department of Technology, Science and Technology, and they have established a task force and all, various means to continually update cybersecurity regulations and policies for the Commonwealth. As far as what other states do in terms of best practices, I'm unfortunately not so much well versed on.
One of the things people could look for guidance is the National Institute for Standards and Technology has released its standard 800-171, which the Department of Defense is requiring all of its contractors to institute for cybersecurity. And it comes up with best practices in 14 different areas of cybersecurity to lock down networks. In Rhode Island, we actually introduced legislation this year. It didn't get much traction. We'll be pushing it next year to actually implement that standard within our systems. So one of the things, the intent, I was the sponsor in the House and Senator DePalma in the Senate, was to really shed a light on those standards and let the folks who are tracking the legislation see that's what we're thinking of and perhaps start looking at that ahead of time. But that's an excellent source for best practices. Another question we have is, I'll scroll down here. Is there a standard share of operating and maintenance costs that an organization should be spending on cybersecurity? Does this vary depending on the kind of organization? So, what level of cybersecurity should people be looking at? Ryan, maybe you want to speak to that a little.
Yeah, it's a good question, but it's a hard question to answer. And I don't know that there is necessarily a hard percentage that I'd say, any particular organization, be it a private company or the public sector, should, be targeting. I do think that the questioner is right that the amount you should spend will or should depend upon the kinds of the sensitivity of the data you have, as well as the kinds of threats you're facing. And I mean, part of the reason it's so hard is, very few organizations on the planet can spend as much money as, whether it's Microsoft or any other of the large technology companies can spend what we spend on cybersecurity. Even private companies, I mean, it doesn't make sense, for example, for a Wall Street firm to spend $1 billion a year on cybersecurity. It does for Microsoft because we're in the business of protecting other people's information. And so, if because trust is so important to our business, if we have a major, security breach, then that would have a major impact on our business. So I do think it's worth going through it's not sexy, and, it may not sound exciting, but actually walking through your state's cybersecurity and IT policy to make sure that you're taking a risk-based approach, to make sure that you're prioritizing where you spend the money you have, and frankly, to also look at what functions and what data does it make sense for the state to, offload onto a private cloud services provider who can spend a lot of money protecting it, as opposed to, trying to do all of that by yourself.
No, thank you. That's hefty, though. I mean, often I've heard that exact phrase used, the risk-based approach, because you could bankrupt yourself and have a company could bankrupt itself and have the best cybersecurity, but really it's looking at, what is practical, and really also what's required of you contractually or through your insurance carrier. A lot of people say, oh, sure, I have great cyber. Then they have an issue. They look at their insurance policy and they see that, there's an exclusion because they failed to do something contractually with their insurance carrier. I'll pose this question to David. What are some pitfalls to avoid in legislative language that could hinder prosecution?
Yeah. So I think one big pitfall that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier is that we want to avoid reinventing the wheel in terms of drafting new language. I think a lot of the time we get caught up with all of the jargon that goes along with technology, and people want to create new standards and they want to create completely new language in code sections that just don't appear anywhere else. And so in Virginia, we really try and keep the same language consistent throughout the code and keep the standards. I know a few years ago we had an issue where we were looking at our computer trespass statutes, and the current standard is that in order to be prosecuted, you have to have trespassed with malice, which is a pretty tough bar for prosecutors to meet. I mean, that's just a pretty high standard, but they were going to a standard of without permission, which was also in the code already. Just would have been a little bit too lenient. I mean, you could have gotten a whole bunch of people who accidentally clicked on some link or opened one of my, my documents on my computer's network, and if it was a total accident, you would have done that without permission. So we shipped it off to a study group, and they suggested changing the standard to, I think it was intentionally deceptive means, which was completely new language, and it ultimately didn't pass because there were a lot of concerns that a court was going to have a hard time applying that kind of a standard without any precedent. So you just want to avoid having too many different standards and new sort of phrases that go along with it just because it's a technological issue.
I actually might, if I could, I might piggyback on that answer, which I thought was a really good one. From our point of view, the biggest challenge to bringing prosecutions with respect to hacking and the like isn't the laws on the books. it's really having the resources and the technical expertise in law enforcement and prosecutors' offices, which is a big challenge. But from our point of view, most computer trespass laws, that are perhaps based on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act at the federal level, provide prosecutors with plenty of ammunition to bring cases. But, a lot of, say, county prosecutors and police departments don't necessarily have the resources or expertise. They haven't been trained on how to bring those cases. And so that is certainly an area where, we could see a lot of improvement. And, of course, it only costs money, right, to provide that training and expertise. But, if it was possible to improve that side of the ledger, I think it would be a good thing.
Great. And Ryan, just a question is, what kinds of advice and expertise can IT professionals provide to help in the policy-making area?
Well, I think in general, we have a big need for people with technical backgrounds to engage in the policy-making arena. I mean, I tell, a lot of my students at Seattle U who have computer science backgrounds and the like, how unique their skill set is, because you need people who can translate, if you will, translate the Greek that all of the wonderful nerds we have, like here at Microsoft, for example. And nerd, you should know, in our company in the tech industry is not an epithet. It's actually a compliment. But to be able to translate that into language that people with non-technical backgrounds can understand. And so I just think that there's a critical need for that, and I like to encourage folks with technical backgrounds who are interested in doing that to get involved, because I think they can be a big help.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are at exactly 3 p.m., and I would like to thank you all for participating again, and thank you to the National Conference of State Legislatures and our co-sponsoring groups. Thank you for joining us. The webinar has been recorded. It will be made available on the NCSL website next week. Thank you again. Our webinar is now concluded.